Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. We've spent the last few episodes talking about molds and how they transform cheeses as they age. Today, we're back to bacteria and how Americans' fear of the whole topic and everything and everyone associated with it has robbed us almost completely of an entire category of cheese. We're talking about the washed rind cheeses. Stereotypically, these are the ones that smell like dirty socks. But in fact, the nose of these cheeses can range from very mild to strong, and from floral or fruity to, funky. And my friends, that funk, it was such a contentious social issue in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the US that it eventually led to the creation of craft singles. American cheesemaking has only just begun to recover from it. There are basically two subcategories within the washed rind world. Some of these cheeses are washed with a brine impregnated with a family of bacteria called corniforms, of which the most famous is Brevibacterium linens, which is in the same family, though not the same thing, as the Brevibacterium epidermis that likes hanging out between your toes. These cheeses take on an orangish hue on their rinds. Really, it can be anywhere from a pale salmon to almost boiled lobster red, depending on the strain of corniform bacteria being used. But just because you see a cheese with orange on the edge in the supermarket, that doesn't mean it's a washed rind. It takes time and skill to develop colored rinds, so many mass-produced cheeses are simply dyed orange with annatto and barely aged. It's way cheaper for the producer, and it produces extremely mild cheeses that no one could possibly object to, except for their lack of flavor. In fact, you're truly in no danger of picking up a stinky sock cheese in a typical American supermarket. They simply aren't sold in any that I've visited. Only the dyed knockoffs are. Now, other washed rind cheeses are washed with wine, beer, cider, or any number of other spirits. Because they're not as directly impregnated with the corniforms that produce that smelly sock odor, this group of cheeses tends to have a wider appeal, although they too can emit aromas, especially at room temperature. The association of cheese with alcohol is not coincidental. We've talked about how cheeses like to age in more or less the same conditions as booze does. So when you've got some of both sitting in the same place, and you need something acidic to help keep molds on your cheese at bay, using one on the other is a pretty obvious thing to do. And then, when you find out it adds flavor to the cheese, so much the better. And there's something else that tends to be associated with both cheese and alcohol production: abbeys. Throughout the Middle Ages, they were some of the largest landowners in any given region of Europe, and they therefore had the space to graze a lot of animals, grow a lot of fruit, build enormous cellars to store and age things in, with plenty of labor to tend to it, and one other thing. Even more than lay people, the religious personnel were expected to observe the innumerable no-meat feast days that occurred throughout the year. Cheese is always a good calorie and nutrient-dense alternative source of protein, but the corniform washed cheeses especially take on a meaty, bacony flavor and sometimes a slick surface, with some resistance when you bite into it, neither gooey like a bloomy rind nor crumbly like many blues and pressed cheeses. In other words, the experience of eating one of these cheeses is every bit as reminiscent of eating a slab of bacon as a modern engineered soy version. Actually, more so if we're being honest. So these cheeses filled a very important and pleasurable niche in the diets of the religious orders. And some of the most famous washed rind cheeses, from Münster to Livarot, retain that abbey association even today. In the wine-producing regions of southern Europe, young cheeses may be soaked in wine for anywhere from 1 to 3 days, or perhaps several weeks. The surface takes on the dark purple red of the wine, and the flavor permeates through the cheese a bit. And as the cheese subsequently dries out and ages in the cave takes on the smell of a musty rural wine shop. Sometimes the cheeses are coated with the lees or sediment left over from winemaking, which again flavors the cheese while keeping a physical barrier between the curd and any wandering surface molds. There are many variations on this found all over Spain and especially in Italy. The most commonly available in the US are Ubriaco from Italy and Cabral Vino from Spain. The Swiss cheese Appenzeller is also washed, though not soaked, with white wine during its aging process. Because those are very large wheels, the flavor of the wine isn't especially noticeable in the cheese, but it perfumes the rind a bit and helps keep it free of mold. At the other end of the texture spectrum, a poisse, a triple cream from Burgundy, is made in small flat wheels of very soft, moist curd, and then washed with corniform laced brine, and then near the end of aging with brandy, yielding a soft, gooey, and extremely pungent cheese. The UK's Stinking Bishop, which began production in the 1970s, is perhaps Britain's answer to a poisse. It's washed with a pear cider called Perry, and it too is a flat disc of soft curd and plenty of surface area relative to the curd to interact with the cider. All right, so let's pause for a minute here to talk about what exactly is going on in that interaction. And to be clear, this applies mostly to the deliberately stinky cheeses, not to the taller, harder pressed cheeses that happen to have some contact with a spirit at some point. Mostly these stinky cheeses are made from very soft curd that still contains a lot of moisture when it's put in the cheese forms. This means there's still a lot of lactose in the curd, as well as the lactose-eating starter cultures. So even as the cheese drains in the molds, maybe under a light weight, there's still acidification going on in the curd, leading to a higher acid cheese. After the cheese has been brined, it's left in a moist environment that's relatively warm, upper 50s to low 60s Fahrenheit, or roughly 14 to 17 Celsius for some of the milder cheeses, or even warmer, as high as the low 70s Fahrenheit for more pungent ones. During this time, the surface is colonized by yeasts in the surrounding air. The surface begins to feel a little bit slippery in its yeast coat, and the yeasts start metabolizing the lactic acid available in the outer curd. And as they do that, they put out a whole range of byproducts. The first thing you'll notice if you open up the warm chamber at this time is a sharp, fruity smell, like very ripe apples or bananas often. And that's due to the esters being produced by the yeast. Sometimes there can also be hints of ammonia. It's important to keep the air around the cheese moving freely to avoid buildup of unpleasant odors, but still maintain a high level of moisture to keep the surface yeasts comfortable. The yeasts also produce enzymes that help break down the fats and the proteins in the curd, which frees up some of the micronutrients that then provide new food for other passing microorganisms who may also then start to colonize the curd. So there's a lot going on in these rinds in quick succession. Once that yeast coat is fully in place and the telltale esters are in full swing, that's when the cheesemaker does the first wash. Other than the cheeses that go off to bathe in the wine spa for several days, this isn't a full immersion activity by any means. The cheese is just sponged with a brine impregnated with that corniform bacteria, either freeze-dried spores or from a bit of mashed up rind from an earlier batch of corniform cheese. And then it's left to dry off a bit, and then moved to a cooler cave, and then sponged again periodically with the same liquid as it ages. You don't want it to be too wet, or you'll wind up attracting blue molds. But also if the surface gets too dry, the corniforms will start to die, and you'll wind up with a firmer, drier cheese than you had intended. Every time you sponge down the cheese, you're both adding more corniform spores to the surface and also smearing them around to ensure the surface is evenly colonized. So sometimes these are also called smear-ripened cheeses. One thing to remember, though, is that all this action is happening on the rind because the interior of the cheese doesn't have the oxygen that these bacteria need to live. So while all the hot bacterial surface action produces a lot of odoriferous side effects that are apparent to you, the outside observer, they don't actually flavor the interior curd that much. The meaty flavors I talked about earlier are a result of the fat and protein breakdown accelerated by these yeasts and bacteria, but otherwise the cheese itself tends to be more mild than the initial ester-driven odor might suggest. Okay, so in between the southern French town of Époisse and the Bishop's Gloucestershire, geographically speaking, there lies a huge array of washed rind cheeses that tend to lean a lot more into the stinky sock territory. The belt that begins in Normandy with Livarot stretches across Belgium into Germany, including Alsace, where Münster originated, and on into Eastern Europe. This is mostly beer and cider country, and those drinks happen to pair particularly well with the corn-informed cheeses. There are also regions that tend to have a bit of a cultural aversion to molds. There are certainly mold-ripened cheeses in these regions, but they're much less common than in the rest of France and Italy, for example. You may recall from our Bloomy and Blue episodes that even Charlemagne allegedly had his suspicions about moldy cheese and had to be convinced to try it. In the modern era, rindless cheeses, aged in wax or even plastic, are more common in these regions. So prior to the introduction of paraffin wax in the 1700s, the way to keep molds off your cheese, especially if you didn't like really dry, hard ones, was to sponge them off periodically with brine. And if you impregnate that brine with a bit of the rind of some previous cheese that turned out the way you like, perhaps because it has that tasty, meaty bee linens flavor, voila! You get orange-rinded, meaty cheeses. And this is where it all came to a head in the United States. So this next part winds up being a fairly explosive tale where the new food sciences of the late 19th century merged with anti-immigrant sentiment, and by the end of World War II, the near total death of flavor in American cuisine. Let's flash back a minute to episode 2 where I talked about pasteurization. That was the big news in cheesemaking in the 1870s. It was part of a huge advance in the science of germ theory. Suddenly, everyone in the cities with any pretense of education was very invested in hygiene. Cleanliness is next to godliness was the mantra of the English-speaking world in the last quarter of the 19th century. Refrigeration, first with literal ice chests, and then increasingly after the turn of the century electric refrigeration, became all the rage in the crowded eastern cities where many people didn't have space for root cellars or other traditional food storage methods. Around the same time, better-off urban dwellers also began to get indoor plumbing and bathing more than once a week. So suddenly, life became generally less odoriferous, if you were the right sort of people. People who had been in the country for some time, who were comfortably established, educated, able to access new plumbing infrastructure. But in the 1870s, there began a wave of immigration to the US from Germany, which at the time also included parts of modern Belgium, and a smaller one from Scandinavia. There had already been a sizable wave in the 1850s of close to 1 million Germans, following the revolutions of 1848. Even through the Civil War period and into the 1870s, there were some 700,000 Germans arriving each decade, rising to nearly 1.5 million in the 1880s. By the turn of the century, German was the second most spoken language in the US after English. With these Germans came a whole new wave of fermented foods, various pickles and sauerkraut, new styles of beer, and lots of notably stinky washed rind cheeses, including Münster and most famously, Limburger. My parents, who lived in Switzerland before I was born, tell me they only bought Limburger in the winter when they could keep it out on the balcony. Otherwise, even wrapped in foil and kept in the fridge, it made their whole apartment smell. So it's genuinely powerful stuff. Now these cheeses, which happen to be one of the main snacks in the beer halls catering to these new masses of immigrants, were showing up just when real Americans, the ones who had been here for 2 or 3 generations, were moving away from anything too pungent. And then the beer halls themselves were problematic, as we might say, what with their loudness and occasional lewdness and stinkiness from unwashed bodies and washed cheeses. The growing temperance movement in the US loved to hold the beer halls up as concentrated examples of societal ills. Now, just as it had always done in the abbeys, the Northern European washed rind cheese served as a cheap, satisfying meat substitute for the heavily immigrant working class. So classism and anti-immigrant sentiment came together to make Limburger in particular a pop culture punching bag. Mark Twain wrote a short story with Limburger as the punchline in 1882. In 1901, the very first Victor 78 RPM recording ever made was of a comedian Bert Shepard's monologue called Limburger Cheese. And it had already been a common trope in vaudeville for a generation by then. The advent of the movies, which initially transferred vaudeville acts to the screen for mass dissemination, brought a whole slew of Limburger jokes to an even wider audience, just as anti-immigrant and specifically anti-German sentiment reached new heights at the start of World War I. German Americans, who soon formed the majority in many of the cities of the upper Midwest, were understandably somewhat sensitive to how their culture and foods were being portrayed. At the same time, as they acquired land and began to acquire a foothold in industrial manufacturing, they were increasingly in a position to do something about it. So brick cheese was invented in Wisconsin in the late 1870s, and it was sold as the married man's Limburger. In other words, it was a more mild form. Other efforts at making milder German-style smear cheeses that would be more palatable to American sensibilities followed as well. Enter James Kraft. Kraft was a Canadian Mennonite who emigrated to Buffalo, New York in 1902 to take a position in a cheddar-making company. However, the company dissolved while he was away on a business trip in Chicago, and he wound up using the money he had with him to found what would become the Kraft Cheese Company. Kraft was a shrewd businessman, and what he and his cheeses lacked in taste, he absolutely made up for in embracing the new industrial food sciences to make his fortune. He invented and patented a form of canned cheese that could be shipped easily without spoiling, and he got a contract with the U.S. government to supply the armed forces with it during World War I. In 1928, he acquired the Philadelphia Cream Cheese Company, and thereafter, his empire supplied roughly 40% of the cheese in the U.S. for many years. And his product was pitched absolutely perfectly to what the mainstream American public had been loudly saying they wanted for the previous two generations. Nothing harsh, sharp, smelly, hard, or challenging to the nose or mouth in any way. It was vaguely cheddar-like in flavor. After all, cheddar was the #1 selling cheese in the U.S. from colonial times until the late 1990s. But it was not sharp or crumbly like cheddar. In fact, it had the very smooth, semi-soft, slightly slick texture of the smear-ripened cheeses so popular in the German-American communities of the Midwest where he settled. But importantly, it had no smell. At all. No rind, no molds of any kind, no seasonal variations in flavor, absolute consistency in every regard at all times. And that set the mold for American cheesemaking for the next 3 generations. We're still recovering from it. Many of the German-American introductions to our national cheese scene are still made today: Münster, Brick, the occasional Liederkranz. But most are no longer smear-ripened. It's an expensive process, and there's no real market for it. The domestic versions sold here in the U.S. are usually dyed with annatto. All that said, there are washed rind cheeses made in the U.S. by artisan cheesemakers. The French reblochon, a gooey, very mild washed rind, can't be imported to the U.S. due to usually being made with raw milk, but Jasper Hill in Vermont and Upland's Cheese in Wisconsin make variations on it, as well as a smaller cheese encircled by a band of spruce bark, known in the French Alps as Vacherin Mont d'Or. The Italian taleggio can sometimes be found in U.S. supermarkets, and there's a domestic rendition made in North Carolina. Red Hawk from Cowgirl Creamery is a firmer, dome-shaped smear cheese. By the way, here's how to tell if an orange cheese you may be looking at is dyed or a real washed rind. First, a real washed rind won't have a perfectly even color. It'll be a little mottled the way your kids' watercolor paintings are paler in some places and darker in others. It likely won't be a strict orange. It'll have shades of pink or red or brown kind of mixed in with it. Washed rinds can be a little gritty, and while you typically can't tell through the plastic, it'll also be slightly tacky or sticky to the touch. That's because when you sponge the cheese with the brine, you often pick up little bits of dried rind and they ball up as you move them across the rest of the damp surface. You should be able to smell something through the plastic. It could be slightly floral or fruity, or something more pungent, like, yes, dirty socks. It's unlikely to be a really strong smell, but if you smell nothing at all, it's probably dyed. And don't worry, the flavor is rarely as strong as the smell. Because of the work of the bacteria who eat the acid, these are actually low-acid cheeses, and the flavor often leans slightly sweet in the way that pork does. And of course, there are also the alcohol-washed and soaked cheeses, Capralvino and Ubriaco. Both domestic and imported versions are pretty widely available. And American cheesemakers are increasingly experimenting with washing other types of cheese with various spirits, not just the ones traditionally done in Europe. These tend to be milder in smell than the orange rinds, but plenty flavorful in their own right thanks to the booze. These are all great cheeses to eat in the cooler months thanks to their sharp or meaty flavors, and they pair well with beer, wine, and cider. You could easily make a weeknight meal by topping them on a dense bread like a rye or a pumpernickel, pairing it with a bowl of soup and a salad. So I hope this episode has encouraged you to step out of the box a little bit and go looking for a genuine washed rind cheese. In our next episode, the last one for this season, we'll talk about fall cheeses and cheeses to look for to put on your holiday boards. So please join me again next time as we once again enter the Curd verse.